Each night, a candle is lit, and the whispering tomes open. Inside are the strange, the forgotten, the stories time tried to silence. Some say history is written by the victors, but here the lost are given voice. Breathe deeply and follow me into the hidden chapters of history.
Its edges. For now, in Bethlem art, as treatment becomes a pact, he brings patience and skill. They bring materials and time. Limits hold like rails. Within them, he builds. You stand at his shoulder, counting with him not agents now, but layers, and each count steadies the hand you watch and the room you share. Broadmoor, the long middle of a life. Broadmoor opens like a wide-walled village. The air is cleaner. The grounds stretch in measured greens. Buildings sit with calm intent, brick and slate, laid in lines that prefer order. You walk with him through a gate that clicks shut without malice. The word is care. The reality is locks. He accepts both and looks for the death. The new model Asylum promises steady routines and space. A doctor meets him with notes from Bethlem and a tone that's both firm and kind. Industrious, courteous, delusions, fixed. They place him on a ward suited to men who work and don't break rooms. He nods, listening, filing voice cadence alongside words, and asks when and where he may draw. The doctor says, daily, under supervision, in the wardroom or a small studio corner when ready. You feel the exhale before you hear it. Your steps carry you to that corner, a good window. Light falling from high and clean, a table scarred by use, a chair that doesn't wobble. He touches the sill, the wood cool under his palm, and then seats himself to test the angle of light on paper. Outside, birds cross the sky beyond a wire that runs like a fine line through the view. He notes the wire without flinch. Boundaries, he understands. Routine deepens here until it feels like tide. Wake at a bell. Wash. Breakfast. Walk the grounds inside paths marked by gravel that crunches in a comforting rhythm. Work at the table when the ward quiets. Tea when the kettle signals. Yard again. Back to the table. He moves within these rails as if they were staff lines in music, and his hand plays a part that never wavers. His health steadies. The body likes air and regular food. The hand remains sure. The belief remains, too unshakable. Like a not in-seasoned wood that tools don't erase. Staff diaries capture the paradox with the same 4 phrases in slight variations. Industrious, polite, absorbed, unshakable. He helps attendants with chairs. He thanks by name. He returns to the page and to the figures that keep multiplying in his care. Broadmoor's grounds offer him slow circuits. You walk beside him as he maps them without mapping paper corner. Bench, path, turn, view of distant fields curbed by the perimeter. He marks a pair of crows that visit a elm at the same hour and smiles when they keep the appointment. He prefers patterns that keep their promise. When one morning the crows don't come, his eyes tighten and then soften as he watches a different bird perch and preen in the same place. Substitution that preserves the rule satisfies him. Requests come from within the walls. A warder asks for a likeness to send home. A clerk wants a tidy image of the chapel. He accepts commissions as tasks that set shape to time. He draws faces with patience and without flattery, finding in a jawline the weight of hours, in a brow the simple pride of a job done without fuss. He gives these small portraits to people who are not used to being seen with such care. The gifts travel to mantles where his name is said in kitchens that will never see his canvases. He paints small scenes of fancy between these requests. The glades return. The figures shrink to the size of thumb joints and stand in precise attitudes that echo theatre and folklore while answering only to his lore. He still writes little notes beside them, sometimes so a sleeve aligns, so a leaf tucks under but less often. The code is now in his hand. He doesn't need to explain it to himself as much. Doctors check in on the core. Do the voices persist? He answers without drama that instruction continues. He doesn't argue or evangelize. He simply refuses to discard the frame. They ask about remorse and receive the line they know. Regret for distress, fidelity to order. They record. They adjust nothing because adjustment lies outside this man's reach and also outside theirs. You notice a shift in scale. Broadmoor's steady time and safer store of materials let panels grow. Not huge, but larger than Bethlem's drawboards. He stretches his attention over wider fields without losing the hum of tiny strokes. Jewel tones move more boldly, numerald, carmine. A sober gold, still precise, still cool to the eye, but richer. He knows how to make a leaf gleam without shouting. He knows how to place a seed cap so it crowns a head with both joke and justice. The studio corner gathers objects that become his private cabinet. Dried thistles, seed pods, small stones, feathers. He turns each into emblem. He studies their structures with a watchmaker's patience and stores their angles for later use. An attendant watches him line 3 thistles across a sill, measure their spines with a brush handle, and smile when the distances echo a harmony only he sees. The attendant later writes that the man smiles when numbers fit. Visitors step into the ward with caution and leave with a tilt of awe. A brother comes, aged a little, and sits with him by the window. They speak of family in clipped phrases and of ordinary things. A neighbor's cart, a leak patched, a nephew's lesson. He offers his brother a small drawing of a path through ferns. The brother holds it as if the paper were warm. You feel the small bridge hold, slender but real. Now and then an outsider patron, doctor from another facility. A curious official asks to see his work. Staff curate the encounter. Look, don't press, marvel, but quietly. He stands aside and lets eyes travel over the tiny armies of figures and stems. He answers questions about technique, not meaning. He names pigments, if asked. He won't decode the theatre of his glades. He lets the surface speak because surface is honest and safe. Meanwhile, the institution's own record keeps a steady drumbeat. No incidents, no threats, no breakages, delusions, unaltered, mood serene, sleep fair when work complete. Appetite better in summer. He ages into these lines, and the lines settle into him. Decades begin to gather without spectacle. Broadmoor becomes the town he lives in, with trees that grow and men who retire and new ones who learn his name on their first day. In this quiet he starts the painting that will define him. The first marks don't announce themselves as a masterpiece. They never do. He tapes a rectangle, tests a ground, and draws guidelines that partition space into a stage with no sky. He sets a figure, then 2, then 6, each with a tusker hand about to strike, a gaze fixed, a posture that suggests a story you'll never fully hear. He works as ever, breath held, stroke placed, breath released. Only the density changes. It thickens like leaf litter on a forest floor, layer upon layer, until your eye walks instead of looks. Staff notice the commitment. He returns to the same board day after day with a fidelity that reads like vow. He tends the scene the way a gardener tends a plot, pruning a leaf here, tucking a stem there, training a tendril to arc just so across a gap. He adds figures at the edges, as if the painting were a crowd that keeps arriving. He keeps a small verse book near, jotting lines that catalogue names and roles, pinning imagery with words, so the world he's making won't slide. Through seasons, through small epidemics that skirt the wards, through uniforms that change cut and clerks who change handwriting styles, he keeps building that stage. Birds cross the window beyond the wire. Bells mark hours. Keys turn. He paints. He paints as if patience were the only coin that still buys time. And in this middle stretch, the long, quiet middle you feel how a life can hold. Belief fixed, body calmer, work deepening until the hand finds a world it can keep. The fairy fella's master stroke, conception. You're with him at the windowed corner in Broadmoor when the idea gathers, not as a flash, but as a slow, sure tide. A new, primed panel waits. He tapes a rectangle with care, sets faint grid lines, and tests a pencil point on the margin. He has a world in mind the size of a human chest and dense enough to hold him for years. He is ready to be held. Orange clues, sit close. A warder who admired his glade scenes asks for something more elaborate, something that could anchor a wall. The request folds into his own bent toward crowd and order. He's long studied fair folk in theatre and tale spirits that let him place human impulse in small, precise borders. They offered drama without the blunt weight of history. They let him be exact and sly at once. The inside name for the project doesn't arrive first. The shape does. A stage of earth, no sky. Figures arranged to enact a scene that points toward a single act withheld. You watch the first grid lines appear, faint but decisive. He maps a midline, then quarters, then smaller cells that let him place a figure with a draftsman's accuracy. He breathes, marks, checks. A tiny world wants a builder who can keep scale without losing life. That's him. He places a low horizon, then drops it further until ground almost fills the frame. The decision is key. No distant vanishing point, no grand air. This will be a press of near things, a theatre floor. Characters multiply, but not as clutters. Each figure has a task, a posture, a line of sight, a tall elder, a jester, a woodman. A child types more than portraits. It's set into a web of intent. He sketches hats that look like seed caps and helmets born from acorn cups. He gives a thistle the weight of a spear and a dock leaf the calm of a banner. You lean in and see how plant parts become armory and costume. Nothing is random. A burr is a shield, a husk is a drum, a cobweb is a sash. The conversion from plant to prop is both joke and lore. He begins to name them, not on the face of the picture, but in a small notebook he keeps to the side. Names anchor roles so the array won't slide in his mind between sessions. Some titles ring with folklore, others with private puns. He isn't writing literature. He's pinning butterflies, keeping taxonomy straight so the crowd can breathe without scrambling. He writes verses short, clipped like a playbill that keeps the cast from blurring. The rhymes are serviceable, the function clear. Language holds place like string wound round pegs. Central to the scene sits a promise, a single master stroke. He models the moment as a ceremony that leads to one decisive act. The blade that will fall isn't swung here. It's held, anticipated, weighed by many eyes. He tests compositions where the act happens. Each time, the scene collapses. Certainty kills drama. He learns what theatre always knew. The withheld blow binds attention. He chooses to pause the world before the cut. Layers begin, underdrawing in light pencil. Over it, a first wash thin, cool, to set general tones. He lets it dry, then returns with a tiny brush and stipples leaf surfaces until they gleam. He uses jewel tones, but never floods. He tucks color into cells like enamel. It's patient work that asks a steady hand and a steady breath. He has both. He builds crusts of texture so fine that the eye can't skim. It has to walk. Each step is a placed dot, a short line, a stroke that answers a neighbor-like mosaic. The composition grows outward. Edges don't sit idle. He populates borders with figures who do not look in, but across, as if the painting continues beyond frame. The stage effect strengthens. No sky means no escape. You feel the compression. It isn't cruel. It's focused. He wants you near. He wants you complicit in the pause. He returns to the grid often, checking alignments so that sight lines converge on the withheld act. Lances point, fingers point, eyes point. Even the angle of a thistle's spine leans you inward. He draws tiny foreshortenings that would mock a less exact hand. A fairy foot planted on a seed, toe splayed to take balance, reads as solid as a boot on a plank. He cares about weight at miniature scale. That is part of the spell. The scene must feel heavy enough to hold your gaze and light enough to float inside a mind. Buses expand in the notebook. He scribbles them at his desk, then copies fair when the day ends, folding the page and tucking it beside the panel. The list of names becomes a map of intention. He's writing to remember, but also to insist that each figure's task is moral as well as theatrical. The old training in emblem returns. A fool is never only a fool. A crown is never only a crown. He layers meanings without ever tipping into chaos. He can't abide chaos. Staff notice the devotion. Attendants time tea so he can finish a cluster before rising. A doctor stands back and sees that the picture keeps the man where talk can't. He notes the paradox again. Delusion fixed, labor exemplary. Permission widens to a steady slot of morning and afternoon at the panel, with breaks to rest the eye. He honors the breaks if they fall at a seam. If not, they wait. You feel the years slip into the paint. Seasons pass the window. Uniforms change. A new superintendent signs a line in the ledger with a different hand. He remains with the same board. Edges deepen. Figures accrue detail. A cap gains stipple. A beard gains strands. A leaf gains veins upon veins. He delays satisfaction by design, always leaving a small section unsealed so tomorrow has a ledge to grip. This is stamina made visible. The crown of the project, the masterstroke, stays reserved. He paints the preface to it with the attention of a surgeon preparing an incision. He balances the crowd so that anticipation hums, not screams. He rehearses in miniature. On scraps he tests a blade's angle in light and in shadow. Each time the painted cut looks too loud to final. He returns to pause. Meanwhile, the culture outside Broadmoor tilts toward fairy menu illustrations. Theatre tableau, poems, but his world isn't sweet. Charm and edge share the stage. He has known what a blade can do. He knows that ceremony around a blow shapes a community for good or harm. The painting holds that knowledge without stating it. He lets symbols carry what he will not say. Years stack, layers build like leaf litter. The surface takes on a quiet gloss from repeated touch. Attendants swap shifts and still talk in low voices about the picture that never ends. He hears them and smiles, not offended. Endless isn't the point. Right is, he will stop when the pause is tuned so cleanly that your breath holds without conscious choice. He sets the brush down at day's end, aligns it to the panel edge, and sits back. The crowd looks frozen and alive at once. The blade has not fallen. Your chest is a held note. He watches you watch, and in that mutual pause, you understand the choice he's made. To make suspense itself the subject, to stretch a second across years, to build a stage where control can live without harm. The fairy fella's masterstroke, construction and meaning you lean in. The surface looks like a meadow at first, then a stage, then a map of intention. Technique sits right at the front of your eye. He builds with a tiny brush that carries the smallest drink of paint. Stipple first, then a short hatch, then a dot to lift a highlight. He layers jewel tones emerald, garnet, amberine to cells so small they feel enameled. He avoids glare. He aims for a covered gleam, as if light were caught and trained. No sky. That decision matters. The plane of earth becomes floor. The crowd arranges not in depth but in tiers, like theatre blocks. You read it left to right, but also down and back like a chessboard. He controls pace with density. Where he wants you to slow, he thickens texture. Where he wants you to breathe, he lets a leaf open like a small pool. Even the empty inches are work. Lean closer. Seeds become helmets. Thistles spearhead a militia. Nettle stiffs stiffen into pikes. A burr set just so reads as a rounded buckler scuffed from use. A dock leaf carries rank like a sash. He never lets a plant be just a plant. It's drafted into service without losing its plantness. That double identity, foliage and armorelets, charm and threat share a single line. Weight is a concern at this scale. He foreshortens fairies with care so their feet grip seed heads instead of floating. A heel digs into pith. Toes spread. Balance is physics, not myth. He sets shadows under ankles so your eye accepts mass. That's why the scene feels crowded and grounded at once. The stage effect works because the bodies obey gravity. even when no sky exists above them. You notice sight lines converging. A king shape looks past you toward a central axis. A fool leans, finger crooked, eyes drawn to the same point. Spears angle inward. Even a thistle's spine tips, barely, toward the promise of the blow. He composes like a conductor, bringing sections to a held chord. The chord is suspense. You feel the held breath, and your breath starts to match it. Read in the crowd becomes a game of folklore and theatre. Types assemble, a bearded elder with a wand of reed, a jester with acorn cap bells, a woodman with a blade meant to be used, attendants whose costumes argue status in inches. There are court figures and commoners, nimble pages and watchers at the margin who seem to guard the frame itself. He draws from old stories to gather roles, mediators, tricksters, judges, and the faceless many who witness and thus make an act social. Private myth slips in too. Some figures have tasks that only his verse explains: charge, names, titles, small duties that turn costume into function. You don't need the text to read the picture, but if you had it, you'd find an index of intent. He keeps law in the margins and performance in the paint. Psychology lives in the method, control through micro-order. A mind that once counted steps and thresholds now counts stipples and veins. Mania made miniature, you might say. But be careful with that word. What you see is a coping structure as much as a symptom. He builds a net so fine that thought can't fall through. Each dot is a promise kept. Each edge is sealed so nothing leaks. The world holds because he makes it hold. Meanwhile, a cultural echo hums outside the walls. Mid-Victorian Britain loves fairy scene stage, tableau, soft illustrations, poems that dress danger in sugar. He refuses sugar. His fair folk carry edge. Their tools cut. Their crowd can applaud a blow. He paints charm with a thin blade under it. The audience of his day might have seen whimsy. You see a tribunal, a ceremony where a community fixes its gaze on one decisive act and lends it force by watching. That act does not happen here. He withholds the masterstroke. It's a compositional stroke and a moral one. In his hands, the pause becomes the subject. Suspense is the air everyone breathes. He understands that a blow freezes a scene. Anticipation keeps it alive. The title teases resolution, then denies it. The denial is merciful. It's also strategic. He doesn't want the picture to be about aftermath. He wants it to be about decisioner, second, that could still bend. Technique serves that idea line by line. He intensifies edges, near the central axis so the eye vibrates there but can't cross. He thickens stipple under the poised blade to make the ground feel ready to receive shock without showing shock. He uses warm notes around the focal figures and cools the periphery so temperature funnels you inward. He sets a tiny glint on metal and then mutes it, as if to say, not yet. Time enters the surface as labor. Years leave their trace in the way layers sit. No haste, no shortcuts. Pigment is thin in early fields, thicker in late. If you scan from left lower corner to upper right, you can read seasons of attention. He returns to a leaf months later and knots a vein in with the same hand steadiness he had on day one. The consistency is eerie and calming. The panel becomes a record of time held under discipline. Meaning builds in parallels. There's theatre with its ceremony and crowd. There's folklore with its trick and judgment. There's private law with its insistence on order. And there's the viewer's own gaze, which joins the crowd and bears some responsibility. You are a witness. By leaning in, you become part of the ceremony that pauses at the brink. The painting makes you complicit in its ethics of delay. You think about his life, the act he committed, the institution that holds him, the hand that now refuses to let a pictured blade fall. He doesn't paint confession. He paints control without harm. That reading isn't soft. It's disciplined. The work isn't redemption in any grand claim. It's a structure that keeps a dangerous logic busy with safe difficulty. The difficulty is real. Anyone who has tried to stipple a leaf to life knows what kind of hours it asks. He signs not with flourish, but with the confidence of craft. The surface is so exact you hear your own noise when you move, breath, fabric. Attendants said the pitch-quieted rooms. You feel why. It's not a lullaby. It's an attention engine. It tethers jittered to detail until the mind tires of threat and accepts pattern. Even the edges talk. Along the frame's borders, figures half enter and half leave, as if a larger procession surrounds this cut scene. That choice erases the idea of a closed tale. You're seeing one ritual, one paused moment among many, as if the world he's built runs on law beyond the canvas. It enlarges the stage without enlarging the panel. Stand back a step. The jewel tones knit into a low shimmer. Nothing is flat. Even a patch of bare ground is scaled with mark upon mark, like fish skin under light. Step closer again. A single hair stroke becomes a blade of grass. A pair of dots becomes a seed's sheen. The painting rewards every distance with a new truth. That's the mark of a world, not a mere picture. In the end, he chooses to stop before the stroke. He sets the brush down. The pause stays tuned. He leaves a note elsewhere that catalogues rolls, as if to anchor the scene in language so time can't smudge it. He accepts that incompletion is the right finish. It's not indecision. It's restraint as design. You hold the gaze a moment longer. Your chest stays at that held note. The crowd expects. The blade waits. The leaf veins gleam with patient labor. Meaning settles like dust. Control can be an art. Suspense can be merciful. And a hand that once did harm can spend years perfecting the second before harm, and stop there. Poems and paratext, elaboration in words. You'll move from the paint to the pages he kept beside it. A slim notebook, creased at corners, sits like a key. He called one long piece elimination of a picture and its subject. You opened two lines that read like a playbill, crossed with a ledger. Names stack, roles fix. The poem doesn't perform beauty. It clasps the scene so it won't slide when the brush rests. You read the cadence, short, clipped phrases. A rhyme when rhyme can bind two figures together. He lists a ferry, court, attendants, watchers. A fellow with a tool poised for the deed that never comes. The verses don't decode the painting so much as fence it. Words act as pegs. String runs between them. and the crowd inside the panel stays put. He knew that days would break his flow. The poem lets him return without drift. You feel how the naming works. Language catches each figure and pins a duty to it. A fool's cap is not mere whim. It marks permission to speak crooked truths. A woodman's blade is not only steel. It carries the weight of sanctioned action. He threads old folklore terms with private titles, a taxonomy that suits his law. The poem reads like stage notes you're not meant to see, except he leaves it in reach, as if inviting a careful eye to share his map. Verses and image answer each other. In paint, a bird shield shines. In words, a guard stands fast where the burrs are law. In paint, a thistle leans inward. In words, a thorny spear signals the crowd's agreement. He nails consent into the scene with syntax. That's what you notice. The poem supplies grammar for the theatre he's built. Who acts? Who watches? Who ratifies by gaze alone? He understands that spectators give force to acts. The poem names the witnesses, so the picture breathes that truth. You trace his handwriting, neat, measured, the same discipline as his hatchings. Margins are straight, even when the wardroom jostles. He drafts rough, crosses once, and copies clean, as if he were a clerk transcribing orders. It's an old habit. In childhood, numbers and names lived in his father's books. Here, he builds his own book of roles and lines. You can hear that desk echo. A nurse once said, the pages helped staff understand what they were seeing. You imagine the scene. A visitor peers at the panel and then the poem, and something clicks. The names reduce guesswork. The poem functions as a guide inside the asylum walls, a bridge from the inward code to a shared reading. It's not a manifesto. It's a courtesy to future eyes, and maybe to his own. On days when the world pressed and the next stroke needed a named target, there's humor, quiet and dry, threaded through. A minor character gets a title slightly too grand, as if he's teasing the puffed-up roles that crowd any court. He keeps his tone cool, never sentimental. The joke is structural, like a hinge that lets the door swing without squeal. Even jest is ordered. He never lets language run. P calls attention to staging. Lines speak of rank, file, stand, advance. Words that turn the crowd into a drilled company. That military cadence folds against fairy trappings, with a friction that gives the picture its edge. He doesn't say why the fella pauses. He says who waits and how. The poem respects the pause by refusing to rush with flourish. No thunder, no gale. A held breath, written as a list. You'll notice how the paratext grows beyond one poem. He writes captions for smaller works, scraps of verse that tie a motif to an idea. Contradiction gets paired lines that set one law against another. Passion panels receive single words that serve as keys. Envy, anger, pity. Each text is a handle. You grab it, and the image turns without slipping. In a place where disorder haunts, he builds a toolkit to keep reading steady. The pages also record method. He jots, wash thin, green dry stipple stop. Not to instruct others, but to keep his own pace honest. He knows his mind can pour. The notes are sluices that keep flow from flood. If a day breaks mid-task, he writes a crib. Return to Thistlehead's right edge. Next morning, he's back in the exact inch. That's what the poem does at scale. It bookmarks the moral scene. You think of medieval illuminators who glossed margins with tiny hands pointing to text. He does a similar thing, but in reverse. His poem points back into the image. It says, "This figure is not random. This gesture has a chain." The analogy holds because both practices illumination and his liveware art meets devotion to order. Tiny work done in service of a frame bigger than the page. Sometimes the words run ahead of paint. He names a character not yet drawn, sets a duty, then later paints to meet the sentence. It's a reverse sketch. Language drafts the stage direction. The brush brings it on. On other days, the paint leads, and the line in the notebook follows like a label tied to a specimen. Either way, text and image move in tandem, braided, neither bossing the other. You see one revealing note, leaf stroke in silence. It appears late in the poem, near the lines that circle the fella. Silence, then, isn't absence. It's an instruction. The poem tells the painter what not to do, and by extension tells you what not to expect. The title promises action. The verses fix the pause. He refuses closure in paint, and he memorializes that refusal in words. Visitors who read the poem aloud report a curious effect. Rooms quiet. The clipped cadence settles people the way his stipple settles ground. An attendant wrote that on days when the poem was shown to guests, voices dropped after a paratext becomes atmosphere. It's not music, but it acts like a score the eye and ear can share. You close the notebook and feel how the pages enlarge the work without inflating it. They keep the picture honest to its design. They let meaning travel beyond the ward without wobble. In a century that loved moralizing captions, he turns the practice to a stricter purpose. Not moral for show, but order as anchor. You look back at the panel. The crowd waits. The blade is still in your pocket. The poem's steady names continue to list. Between them, a choice holds. The paint makes you lean in. The words keep you from rushing past the pause. Together they build a quiet engine. Attention, restraint, control. You feel it in your breath. You feel it in your hands. And you carry the list forward, because language well placed lets a fragile balance last. Other asylum works, passions, contradiction, and seclusion. You turn from the crowded fairy stage to other panels that marked his years, and the air shifts. These are quieter, colder, more emblem than scene. The passions come first, a series where feeling is caged and posed. He builds them like stage masks, anger with a line of jaw edged like iron, envy with an eye that slides, and a hand that inches toward what isn't hers, pity leaning forward, weight in the knees, a palm open but held back by a subtle band. Each figure is ordered. The excess that passions promise never spills. That's the key. Feeling is translated into sin. You stand close and see how he reviews his storm. Anger doesn't flare. It tightens. Grief doesn't sob. It sits and pulls its coat about itself with a neatness that hurts more than tears. Love looks straight on, not swooning, as if devotion were best shown by staying upright. He uses the vocabulary of emblem books, tributes, postures, small objects as keys so that a viewer who reads slowly will find the code. The paint is clean, the edges hold. He will not let an emotion wreck the frame. Stakes live inside that restraint. In a place where men sometimes shout through nights, he makes images where noise cannot enter. You sense a self-lecture in the series. Feel, but don't break. Show, but don't spill. Acknowledge impulse, then seat it in a chair with arms. The staff who watch him work on these panels write notes about calm in the room. The passions teach the eye to stay. Contradiction arrives as a puzzle. Two logics share the same space and refuse to fuse. On the surface, it's a picture of two groups who inhabit one small world on different rules. A path cuts the scene. On one side, a figure steps left to right, while all signs point right to left. On the other, a structure with perfect symmetry houses a ladder that goes nowhere. You look once and think it's a whim. You look twice and feel the tension gather. He builds the tension with craft, alignments that should miss by the width of a hair. A shadow falls as if light came from two suns. A fence exists for one group and not for the other. Figures pass through on one side while, inches away, others press their palms to board. The choice isn't sloppy, it's exact. Logic A and logic B both hold within their lanes. The discomfort comes at their seam. That seam is the subject. You hold your breath and think of his mind at the threshold of belief in the world's rule. Contradiction isn't rage here, it's structure. Two orders sit inside one picture and keep not fitting. He doesn't force them to reconcile. He shows what non-fit feels like to an eye that wants unity. The eye strains. That strain is the point. He's honest about it. He doesn't paint comfort and call it truth. Then the panel that reads like a self-portrait without a face, the rock and castle of seclusion. The title tells you what the image means, but the picture carries its own weight. You stand before a cliff that is both rock and architecture, built block by block with a mason's patience. The castle grows straight from stone, as if withdrawn life could calcify into home. A narrow path climbs. Windows pin small squares of dark in the mass. There's water at the base sill, guarded by legend, a thin tree that finds perches in a crack. You trace the blocks with your finger in the air. Each stone is hatched, shaped, seated. He lavishes care on the seam between one block and the next, the fitted joint where pressure transfers. You feel safety there. You also feel airlessness. A gate exists, but it's tucked high and tight. Light touches select planes. It doesn't flood. He's tuned the castle to be refuge and trap at once. You read the title and hear both notes. A rock to cling to. A castle that keeps others out and the self in. He places a tiny figure on the path, almost lost against the mass. The figure ascends, head bowed in concentration, a hand on the wall. No threat pursues, no battlement fires. The drama is effort itself, calm, contained, endless. He's telling you something simple and hard. Retreat can be a practice, not an event. You can do it daily until the path wears smooth and the legs know the grade. He paints that practice into stone. Staff notes about this picture are brief and careful. A nurse writes that he seemed eased in the making. Another adds that the panel occupied him steadily. The superintendent, who cares about outcomes more than symbol, records improved sleep on days when stone courses advanced. The panel becomes a clock. Each course laid is an hour held. You feel time nested in the joints. Across these works, patterns keep surfacing. Obsessive detail functions as a coping frame. Micro-order replaces global certainty with local mastery. In passions, emotion is named and seated. In contradiction, misfit is contained and displayed without forced union. In seclusion, withdrawal is engineered with tenderness for the one who must live inside it. None of these pictures perform cure. They perform holding. Light behaves like a rule he can choose. In the passion panels, it's stage light, focused, clarifying, respectful. In contradiction, it's paradoxical, doing two things at once without apology. In seclusion, it's sparse and angled, a tool that defines edge more than it warms space. You see him use light the way he uses line to set terms. Terms are what keep rooms safe here. You step close to the rock's surface and find the same jewel of patience you saw in the fairy crowd, but pointed at a different end. No whimsy on this wall, only work, only care that makes mass believable. He gives you a world that doesn't ask you to believe in sprites. It asks you to believe in masonry. You do. Your breathing slows because the blocks are that convincing. Pretendants who carry keys pass by and pause. Some prefer these panels to the fairy press because the moral is clearer. They say it gently. They live in rooms where the clean idea of seclusion can be a mercy. You hear that and recognize the thin line between depiction and prescription. He walks it, not with slogans, but with craft that refuses chaos. The series of passions never turns into sermon. He isn't scolding, he's arranging. The contradiction picture never descends into trick. He isn't clever for sport. He's mapping the ache where things don't join. The rock doesn't fantasize power. It acknowledges the need for walls and the cost of them. He isn't consoling you. He's being accurate about a life. Patterns in practice link art to care without slogans. Staff schedule work so he can finish a seam, a line, a leaf. He sleeps better with an edge sealed. He thanks them. They write it down. Over months, those entries become their own quiet art. Repetition with minor variation that describes a man holding in a system designed to hold him. You leave the corner where these panels hang with a steadier step. You've seen a method applied to pain. Name it, seat it. Show the misfit, don't force it. Build a refuge. Admit its cost. That's not soft. That's a discipline. You'll carry it when the story moves again, because the next room returns to the crowd and the withheld stroke, and the lessons from these walls, how to hold without harm will let you look longer without losing yourself. Medicine and mind. Victorian theories versus lived routine. You sit with a doctor's notebook and feel the gap between language and life. The page carries neat phrases, moral treatment, monomania, melancholia with exaltation, while the ward carries breath, keys, and the scrape of chair legs. Diagnosis in the mid-19th century leans on categories built from observation more than inner theory. They weigh speech, sleep, appetite, conduct. They don't have your word. They have theirs, and they use them with care, born of limits. The doctor writes that belief is fixed, not merely frequent. Fixed means a thought that sits like a nail in wood. Around that nail, other planks can still hold memory, politeness, craft. He notes coherence. He notes dangerous intersection. When a fixed belief meets an opportunity, harm can happen. He is careful to separate intent from structure. The act was planned as duty inside a system the patient trusts. That's how he frames it for the record. Victorian debates swirl outside the ward. Was the trigger heredity? Was it heat and shock from travel? Is religious language a cause, or simply the dress a delusion wears? A physician cites family temperaments. Another cites climate Egypt's glare and ritual fatiguers, a stress that thinned the mind's sleep until symbols flooded in. A third leans on moral insanity, a phrase that tries to name broken judgment without broken intellect. You hear the debate as respectful and uncertain. They argue to help, not to win. Insight, lived routine, answers more questions than theory can. Breakfast at the Bell matters more than a page on predisposition. Walks at set hours. Work at a desk. Permission within clear limits. These rules make the day turn without friction. He thrives on this because the structure matches his own habits. He files the world. The ward files time. Where the two systems overlap, calm grows. You stand with a nurse who reads the notes aloud in a low voice while he works. Industrious, courteous, delusions unshaken. The words repeat with small shifts over months. One entry adds sleep poor after interruption. Another, appetite fair when allowed to complete a section. You watch the care become a feedback loop. The staff adjust the order. He meets the order with steadiness. The notebook heat maps a life by minor gains. Victorian medicine has ideals it calls moral treatment. No chains, if possible. Fresh air. Gentle authority. Useful occupation. It distrusts spectacle and pernicious cruelties. The ward you walk has these aims, worked out in practice by people whose hands carry trays and keys. When a patient starts to shout, doors close softly, and someone sits nearby, quiet enough to avoid adding heat. When a patient like him needs time to seal a line, a meal waits 5 minutes. Medicine becomes manners at this scale. Debates about cause continues. Some point to the grand tours as a pivot weeks of sleep loss, pressure to produce constant novelty, religious scenery layered on a mind trained for order. Under that press, symbols turned from subjects to instructions. Others factor in temperament, the exactness that once built theater scenes, now repurposed to enact a private code. You keep your language plain. A careful man met conditions that turned his care into a rule that harmed. The staff don't use that sentence. They use entries. Treatment goals stay modest and firm. Keep him safe. Keep others safe. Give him tools to hold his hours. Don't argue with the fixed point unless argument eases him. Some days a doctor tries a soft challenge. Could the voice be mistaken? He answers with the calm he gives to composition. Error is wide, but not here. The doctor records the exchange without forcing it. He knows a standoff when he feels one. You look at restraint as it is used here. Rarely. And then with apology, like a belt across a door rather than iron on wrists. Staff prefer redirection. They bring paper, suggest a task, point to a leaf that needs veins. He takes the cue. You see how much of medicine in this place relies on the patient's willingness to meet halfway. He meets. That cooperation turns care from confinement into a working day. Theories shift as years pass. Heredity gains weight in textbooks. Case studies gather in journals. One writer suggests that men of fine sensibility face higher risk when forced through unusual pressure. Another counters that sensibility alone can't explain an act. They need a trigger, shock, infection, loss, excess, study, fright. Egypt and the Nile appear as shorthand for the foreign strain. The argument remains tentative. They don't know. They say so between lines. Modern words aren't yours to put in their mouths, but you can hold them beside the notebook like two transparencies. Schizophrenia spectrum is a phrase that tries to group fixed belief, voices, and altered affect. It's a frame built decades after his life. You place it gently at the edge and keep it labeled as modern. It explains less than you might hope. Lives don't flatten to terms. He is still a man at a desk with a small brush. Heredity enters the record as a question mark. A doctor writes, family temperament unknown. He asks the brother about mood, fears, fixed ideas. The brother answers in ordinary terms. The father kept books. The son kept lists. Careful men in careful rooms. That's as far as family law goes. Without graphs, they write anecdotes. They do not seal them as proof. Meanwhile, lived routine builds skill into care. He teaches himself how to manage pressure. When the ward hums with noise, he hums back softly and keeps his line true. When a visitor's curiosity leans too hard, he deflects to technique pigment, this brush that turned the talk cools. He shapes interactions the way he shapes panels, by directing attention. The doctor's notebook becomes a second artwork repetition with intention. Continues at picture. Speech coherent. Fixity unchanged. Grateful for materials. Slept 6 hours following completion. Refused inducements to speak against belief. Remained calm. The entries have a rhythm now, and the rhythm comforts you. It presents a man held safely by small acts, over and over, until years turn. Care has limits. The ward can't edit his core story. It can't return him to a city without risk. It can't promise a cure. It can promise breakfast, paper, and a walk under a sky crossed by wire. Within those limits, a life can be lived with dignity. He lives it. He gives the ward work that justifies its trust. They give him time he uses like paint. You step back from the notebook and return to the room where he sits. He looks up, meets your eye, and nods, the small nod he gives when a line lands right. Medicine in this place looks like that nod more than any Therian agreement between hands and rules that lets a day stand. Speaking of which, a visitor's breath fogs the glass at the end of the corridor. The outside has come to look. The notebook will grow another line, and the room will hold. Visitors, viewers, and reputation inside family comes first. A brother signs his name in the visitor's book and is led through halls at softened footsteps. You stand with him at the glass before the ward. He sees the window corner, the careful posture, the brush set at a right angle to the board. When they meet, the greeting is simple, almost plain. How are you? How is the house? Did the leak hold? Facts first. Facts are safe. He offers his brother a small drawing, a path through ferns no wider than a thumb. The brother turns it in the light and nods as if heat comes off paper. You hear a question hovered and not asked. Remorse, belief, the field. He doesn't go there. He asks instead about the old elm. It still stands. That answer lets the visit end in one piece. Occasional patrons arrive with staff near. They've heard of the industrious man with tiny armies of leaves. Inside, curiosity drops its voice. A visitor's breath fogs the glass. You watch their eyes lean to the work. The room learns silence fast. He shows technique if asked how a green is lifted with a point, how a vein sits under glaze. He names pigments and papers. He will not decode the right set on the panel. Meaning stays under craft. It's the safest way to share. Staff play the part of guardians and archivists. They number sheets, paste notes to backstate, mood, sleep after. A nurse folds a small watercolor into cardboard and sets it aside for a superintendent who believes Srecker his care. A warder keeps a likeness he commissioned, a face plain and proud, and writes home that a man inside painted him truer than any mirror. These pages travel to mantels and drawers, where they gather dust and private reverence. Prumer of genius inside a locked place spreads slowly. A critic's friend of a friend visits an uncle who works here and goes back to London with a phrase, fairy scenes made with a watchmaker's hand. It's a small ripple. The city has other storms. Still, the ripple reaches artists who like order and edge. Some think of stage scenes. Others think of emblem books. Few know the ledger in the hospital that joins industry to delusion day by day. He remains steady at the center of this gentle attention. Delusion unshaken, courtesy intact. When a visitor intrudes and uses words like madness, the room cools. An attendant steers, talk to tools. The visitor accepts the cue. You feel a shared rule. No spectacle here. Respect the work and leave the man his anchor. Not all visits soothe. A young painter comes eager and quick, points too close, and asks whether the held blade is regret in disguise. He smiles without teeth and says the title's a design. He returns to the stipple and lifts a highlight on a seed helm until the leaf hums. The visitor flushes, steps back, and learns that some questions are hammers in rooms built on joints. Letters come through stir of hands with family news, births, deaths, weather. He reads them twice, then stores them under boards, as if the words could warp if left loose. He writes, replies, in small, disciplined, script thanks, good wishes, a note about a bird's visit to the elm outside the chapel. He avoids philosophy. He keeps two events that can be checked by two people standing in the same yard. The reputation inside grows on kinder terms. The attendants describe him to new hires as easy, exacting about tools, and fond of finishing a section before tea. They praise patience like a craft in itself. The doctor quotes the same line to visiting committees, industrious, courteous, fixed. You hear the cadence settle into custom. The ward's story and his story braid together like rope. A rare day breaks the routine when a newspaperman is allowed a supervised look for a piece on humane care. He sees the ferry crowd, takes notes, and murmurs that industry can bloom anywhere. He isn't allowed to print names. He prints atmosphere instead quiet, air, windows, orders. You read the column weeks later and feel how public words slip from truth to pose, even when they mean well. The picture profits from the pose. The man remains in his chair. Unknown to them, across town, a small group of artists argue that fairy pictures are a fad gone soft. If they saw this panel, they might hold their fire, but they don't. Inside, he paints slow fire, cool. Outside, the fashion swings. The two currents hardly touch. Meanwhile, a clerk saves clippings in a folder marked with the hospital's name, not his. Inside are notes about exhibitions of fancy subjects, engravings of sylvan stages, and the odd sermon about deceit in pretty things. None mention him, Mr. The clerk wants a paper trail, as if future readers will need a thread. He tucks a ward schedule in the folder, too, a timetable that tells more truth than any etching. You watch one tender scene. A patient from another ward quiet, prone to pacing, stands near the desk and watches him paint a leaf's edge. The man's hand trembles, then settles as he tracks the small certainty of the brush. He doesn't speak. He breathes with the strokes. When the edge closes, he exhales and looks younger for a moment. He walks away slower. A nurse writes, shared calm. Family visits thin as years stack. The brother grays. His steps shorten. Still he comes, sits, and talks about roofs and roads, everything that holds. He brings small news of museums where strangers pause before pictures of kings and saints. He doesn't know that one day strangers will pause before this work and speak his brother's name as if it were always waiting for them. He knows how to hold a hand when it trembles without mentioning the tremble. That is enough. P ages in a chair that fits him. The window's light tilts through seasons. He teaches a new attendant to lay brushes flat, never bristle up in water. The attendant smiles and obeys. Habits travel. That's how influence moves inside these walls, not by manifestos, but by how a tool is put down. In the ledger, a note appears, vision steady, hand slower. Continues at picture. You read it and hear the clock inside the sentence. Reputation outside will have to wait for a generation that loves archives. Reputation inside is softer and more useful. The man who kept to time, who thanked you by name, who made rooms quiet without asking for silence. Night settles early in winter. A visitor lingers at the glass and resists the urge to tap. He leans until his breath clouds and clears, and each clearing shows a leaf more vivid than before. Wonder and unease share the same frames. He walks away on lighter feet, the hush coming with him like a coat he forgot he owned. Late years, diminishing strength, persistent vision. Years accumulate like thin varnish, and you feel it in his breathing. The hand that once laid lines without tremor now pauses before each stroke. He doesn't rush the pause. He treats it as part of the method. Staff write the new cadence into the ledger vision steady. Hand slower and he nods when they read it back, as if hearing his body summarized helps him set the day. Health bends under confinements, long terms. Joints stiffen. Winter damp seeps into bone. He walks shorter loops on Broadmoor's paths, counting fewer turns, resting on a bench that knows him. You sit beside him, and he points with 2 fingers rather than 1. 'You've got to be careful,' he says. as if sharing sight instead of staking claim. He says little about ache. He folds them into routine, the way he folds everything. Inside, the studio corner remains his ground. The window throws a cool band of light across the table. He adjusts the board so the light hits where his eyes still reads best. He brings the brush to his lips to shape hairs, and then waits, a longer beat than before, for the hand to calm. When he finally sets the tip down, the leaf accepts its vein with relief that runs up your spine. Tiny work made tender by age feels like a pact renewed each morning. He guides you closer without words. Look, his gesture says, and you lean. Small works continue penals, modest in size, but dense in care. Themes recur. The glade with figures arranged like a court that never quite ends. The emblem face where anger tightens, not flares. The stone that stacks into refuge. Habit sharpens them. He doesn't invent much now. He refines. He moves through known rooms and dusts corners he once considered clean. Visit us thin. The brother comes, slower and grey at the Templars, and sits longer in quiet. They share weather reports. Frost laid like sugar. A storm that pulled slates. He gives his brother a new drawing. A single fern frond curled like a question mark. The brother traces the curl with a thumb in air and smiles. Neither reaches for words they don't have. Facts, then food, then a hand held a moment longer at parting. Nurses watch the rhythm and keep it safe. They learn that the day should start with a simple motif stone leaf. Should before the crowd calls. They bring tea when the figure at the edge needs only 3 strokes to resolve. They wait. Waiting here is a medical act. When he whispers thanks, he says names. Names anchor him to the room. The ledger keeps pace. Gratitude expressed. Completed section. Sleep fair. He no longer wrestles the big panel daily. He returns to it like a parishioner attending a high day, standing in the pause so many hours have tuned. He doesn't add the stroke. The choice has hardened into kindness. He turns edges, tightens a cap's gleam, strengthens a thistle spine by a hair. Then he stops, not from lack of will, but from a sense that the chord must not be struck. Restraint, at his age, is not effort, it's habit. Meanwhile, he makes smaller fairy scenes that echo the grand one at a lower key. The figures are fewer, the props simpler, the color slightly cooler. You sense he's teaching himself how to step back while staying himself. The teaching shows in the notes he leaves for tomorrow. Return to leaf by left shoe, it's light thin. The clarity guards against the overnight fog that sometimes meets him at waking. Illnesses nibble. A winter cough lingers. He sits with a blanket over knees, brush in right hand, rag in left, and works until the hand warms and the line steadies. Appetite narrows to certain foods, at certain hours habits, wrapped in the practical mask of preference. He keeps his corner neat, even when energy fades. Tools aligned, paper set square, drawer latched with a soft click that satisfies a rule older than ache. Staff notes, stay kind and spare, compliant, absorbed, unwavering. You feel the weight of those words now. They're not placeholders. They're a mended bridge walked daily without fuss. He is easy to care for because he meets care on its chosen ground. In a place where strain can crack rooms, His steadiness continues to quiet others. A younger patient drifts near and breathes with his strokes. An attendant stands a minute longer than needed, the way one does at an open fire. He doesn't talk about outside fame. He doesn't know its scale. A clipping might reach the superintendent's desk about a show, a review, a mention that folds his kind of work into a list. It doesn't reach him. He knows his picture. He knows the next ink. He knows that finishing a seam can make the night short in a merciful way. The rest is missed by choice or design. You watch a final season come easy. Spring grass presses green against the path edges. The elm by the wire pushes leaves like small hands. He paints a bud, not a flower, with a patience that reads like a farewell to speed. He signs a small panel with a steadier line than you expected, and looks pleased in the quiet way he allows himself, chin, lowered eyes, soft. Late one afternoon, he sets the brush down and doesn't list the next step. He folds the rag and lays it across the ferrule, as he always does. Straight, smooth, respectful. He looks at the panel, not with hunger, but with the kindness you give an old friend when you rise from a long talk and know you've said enough. He meets your eye and makes the smallest nod there. It holds. Health falters by inches. A fever passes through the ward. He weathers it. A faintness follows stairs. Nurses find him a seat. He doesn't complain. He narrows the circle again. Bed, table, window, birds beyond the wire. He counts fewer steps and more breaths. The ledger keeps to its script, then turns plain, unwell. Confined to bed, comfortable, quiet. A quiet death in custody ends the entries. Records are spare and plain. Date, hour, witness. You stare at the line longer than the ink requires. It feels wrong that it fits between margins so neatly when the life it ends. Overflowed margins with points and veins and law. That's how ledgers work. They hold by shrinking. The room doesn't empty quickly. Brushes remain aligned. A panel leans dry. A nurse closes the drawer and rests a hand on the wood as if listening for a last hum of care. The window's light keeps falling across the table at the same angle. Outside, birds cross the wire like always. Inside, the quiet he made on hard days seems to linger. It will travel out of the ward, through halls, into a world that will one day lean in and learn to breathe with his lines. Afterlife of the work, rediscovery and scholarship. You step from the ward's hush into a century that learned to look again, early in the 20th century. Curators and writers begin to value what they call outsider and visionary art. The label isn't perfect, but it opens a door. His panels leave institutional drawers for cautious walls. A few small shows test public eyes. Viewers lean in and find that the patience of the hand outlives the locked door that housed it. Exhibitions set the pace. First, modest groupings, drawings from asylums, oddities beside masters, then focused rooms that let his work breathe without apology. You stand in a modern gallery, hush, and feel a familiar pull. The fairy crowd still hums. The rock still holds. The passions still sit upright and refuse storms. The distance between a hospital ledger and museum labels shrinks to a few paces, and that distance carries weight. Critics, freed from the scandal of the act by time, start writing about technique. They talk about micro-order, layered labor, the theater floor with no sky. They point to jewel tones set like enamel, to foreshortened feet that make seeds carry weight. Some note restraint, the withheld stroke has compositional courage. The essays avoid diagnosis, they stick to paint. The better ones grant the context without turning it into spectacle. Scholarship follows, slow and careful. Archivists gather letters, hospital records, early reviews, the slim notebook of verse that tethered the fairy scene. Names like Troman's Alderidge and Graysmith appear on spines and footnotes. They build an archive from scraps, visitor logs, staff notes, sale catalogues, marginal mentions in newspapers. Each writer tests claims against paper and pushes rumor aside. You feel relief when they say what they can prove and mark what they can't. Catalogues, racense, map the known works. Dates settle where records allow. Elsewhere, style and pigment help brackets form. Conservators speak about ground layers and glazes. They show cross-sections, tiny sandwiches of colorand. You see years in strata, thin and patient. A microscope finds a hair caught in varnish. It might be his or an attendant's. The lab notes resist poetry and still feel tender. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with madness threatens to swallow the art. Headline writers reach for drama. The scholar's job becomes a kind of levy. Keep the life honest. Keep the work central. Resist flattening a person to one act. Essays place the patricide inside a medical frame and refuse lurid detail. They let the paintings hold the eye first. They remind readers that institutions kept him safe and that his industry kept rooms safe in return. You see how language shifts? Lunatic yields to patient, then to specific diagnoses discussed with caution. Criminal remains in legal records where it belongs. In galleries it recedes behind artists, not as absolution, but as accurate description of labor. Curators design spaces that emphasize looking. Benches invite time. Labels mention Broadmoor and Bethlem, then list materials and dimensions, as if to say, this is work, measured and exact. Provenance gathers. A watercolor gifted to a warder's daughter reappears from a shoebox. A small panel, long thought, anonymous, gains a signature under raking light. Auction houses test the market and find that rarity and craft command attention. Prices rise, then stabilize, then rise again. Each sale sends scholars back to files to add another line. Present location known. The map of his afterlife sharpens. Writers argue gently about where to place him. Some call him a Victorian eccentric with surgical skill. Others put him near symbolists and theatre designers. Still others fold him into a lineage of English detail that runs from miniaturists to illustrators. The best accounts let him be several things at once. A man of the stage, an emblem. A clerk of leaves and law. A patient who found control in craft precise enough to quiet rooms. Museums stage focused shows. One gathers the passions and sets them in a circle like a calm choir. Another builds a small dark room for the fairy fella's masterstroke, lit so the surface glows without glare. You enter and feel the same pause the ward once held. People speak low. Someone starts to explain and then stops, realizing the painting asks for breath, not talk. You recognize the old engine working in a new house. Scholars publish letters from companions on the grand tour, careful to distinguish transcription from inference. They place his shift in Egypt within a known cadence, sleep thin, ritual heavy, heat constant and resists easy cause. They quote the doctor's notebooks and keep their voices cooled. They note how hospital routine and material permissions shaped the art you see. They keep the 80% fact balance and let the 20% be the quiet you bring to looking. An exhibition catalogue prints his poem alongside high-resolution plates. Readers trace lines with a finger in air and match names to poses. Essays explain paratext without inflating it into a confession. A footnote corrects a long-standing misattribution. Another footnote admits that some dates can't be settled without guesswork and declines to guess. The humility builds trust. University courses adopt the case from modules on Victorian culture, psychiatry, and visual narrative. Students write about audience complicity in the paused stroke, about emblem revived in a secular age, about labor as ethics. They cite primary sources. They learn to separate diagnoses from metaphor. A good seminar ends with a painting rather than a theory eyes close. Silence sits, and the class leaves slower than it came. You hear one warning repeat in scholarship: don't glamorize illness. Don't treat the ward as a romantic garret. The aim is care, not myth. He wasn't cured by art. He was held by it. Institutions held him too, sometimes well, sometimes merely adequately. The record shows both. A careful book makes space for gratitude and critique in the same paragraph. Digitization broadens access. High-resolution images let distant viewers lean in from desks at midnight and see the stipple, the hairline veins, the seeds turned helmets. Archives scanned ledgers so you can read slept well after completion in a clerk's hand. A soundless loop of turning pages reveals the bland power of repetition. Industrious, courteous, fixed. The internet, noisy as it is, delivers a pocket of quiet when the painting fills a screen. The art enters popular culture, sometimes as echo, sometimes as grab. A song borrows the title, an essayist describes a picture to talk about suspense in narrative. Reproductions hang in rooms where the story isn't known, yet the pause still works. Misreadings happen. People say whimsy where there's ceremony. Others romanticize harm. Scholars answer with patience and evidence. Close looking resists cliché. It keeps the person intact. Standing in a gallery, you feel the chain from desk to wall. A nurse timed tea. An attendant locked a drawer. A doctor signed a line. A brother carried a small drawing home. A clerk kept a folder. A curator pinned a label at the right height. A writer cut adjectives. Each act, humble and small, built a path for your feet. You lean in and hear bristles in a jar, far away, ticking like a clock. The afterlife of the work lives in that sound, steady, precise, human. The fairy feller in culture, echoes and misreadings. You stand in the gallery again, but the noise comes from outside. Now reproductions in books, songs that borrow the title, essays that lift the image to explain suspense. The painting becomes a reference, a shorthand for a held breath. When people quote it, they often skip the work and reach for myth. You feel the edge of that. Echoes help the picture travel. They also blur what it is. A band names a track after the painting and sings about caprice in a green wood. The song's charm is real, but it leans on whimsy. Whimsy can cover harm, like moss covers stone. An essayist uses the picture to talk about narrative cliffhangers. He gets close when he praises restraint. He veers when he says the withheld stroke proves genius born from madness. That phrase slides. It makes illness into fuel and skips over the decades of patient craft. Reproductions multiply. Posters, postcards, calendar squares. A thumbnail can't carry stipple. At that size, the crowd collapses into noise. Viewers think clutter where the original reads as choir. You see the risk each time the image shrinks, the discipline goes invisible, and a stereotype steps in. Fairy equals cute. Cute erases ceremony. Ceremony is the heart here. Writers push back carefully. They frame the painting as labor first, symbol after. They place the title's tease in a context of theater and moral delay. They remind readers that the artist chose to pause. Choice matters. The pause is not lacked. It's design. They call out the easy line madman makes masterpiece and replace it with the harder truth. Patient worker, fixed belief, years of careful permission. That swap honors rooms and people who kept time steady. Misreadings cluster around two poles. One glamorizes illness, turning delusion into wild muse. The other flattens the work into a single act. The crime becomes lens and lock. Both ignore the complexity that invites you to look longer. Either way, the person disappears. To hold both truth's pain and polish takes effort. You feel that effort in your chest when you stand before the panel and refuse to let one story cancel the other. Museums curate the problem. They hang the painting low enough that you must lean, forcing you to trade distance for attention. Labels use plain words. Asylum, patient, permitted materials, years in the making. They avoid the lurid. They write about technique, the stipple, the jewel tones, the no-sky stage. They place a bench. They trust that sitting will do some of the work. Words can't. Meanwhile, culture loves mirrors. Viewers use the painting to see themselves. Some see play. Some see threat. Some see a tribunal waiting to confirm a blow they fear in their own lives. A critic once wrote that the picture holds a crowd's gaze like a courtroom does, and that you join that gaze when you look. That reading keeps the ethics in view. It's not about sprites. It's about witness. When you lean in, your breath joins the held note. Comparison becomes a tool. Scholars set the painting next to stage to blow, and to Victorian fairy illustration to show different. Where others paint air and glow, this panel offers weight and flaw. Where others resolve with a flourish, this one restrains. The side-by-side keeps cliched at bay. It reminds you that restraint in an age of sugar is itself a statement. Another echo comes from modern fantasy art that copies surface without spirit. Artists mimic seed helmets and thistle spears and flood them with neon. The detail dazzles and empties. Without the ethic of delay, the props become costume alone. You see the shell without the engine. It's a lesson in how meaning hides in method. Method is slow. Slow rarely survives copy. Publishers print essays that trace misreadings as a genre. They catalogue how often critics smuggle diagnosis into metaphor, calling every dot a symptom. They answer with the 80/20th balance you've carried. Fact heavy, atmosphere light. They print page images of the hospital ledger beside details of the paint, so readers must hold both. The ledger says industrious, courteous, fixed. The detail says patient, exact, paused. Together they push back on neat stories. The picture enters classrooms and YouTube feeds. A narrator whispers about courts of leaf while a camera glides across the surface. Sometimes the whisper slides into fiction, invented names, invented motives. You feel the line cross. When the facts are enough, invention adds noise. Better to narrate the true labor, the grids, the stipple, the choice to stop and let the hush do the rest. Collector's commission prints. A good print house uses raking light to catch relief in varnish, scans in slices, stitches, and proofs until greens sit where they should. A bad one crushes mid-tones and sells glare. Quality becomes an ethics test. Care carries respect. Cheapness breeds myth. The painting also becomes a metaphor in debates about justice. Writers point to the poised blade and ask whether delay is mercy or cowardice. They argue about pauses that never end and acts that, once done, can't be undone. The panel doesn't answer. It holds the question. That's its strength. It refuses to dignify haste. It invites you to weigh. You notice how often people ask, why no stroke? The most honest answers say, because he decided not to, and because choice is the point. The pause is moral and formal. It reverses the logic that ruled his worst day. In a room built on order, he learned to keep the blade still. That reading keeps you from heroizing harm. It honors change without claiming cure. Misreadings will keep coming. Culture likes easy frames. Your job, as a viewer who knows the archive, is modest. Keep looking close, correct gently, share sources, resist gossip. When someone calls the painting whimsical, take them to the thistle spine. When someone calls it confession, take them to the verse that says, leave stroke in silence. When someone treats the ward as romance, take them to the ledger, sleep fair after completion. Draw back a step. The crowd still waits. The blade still hovers. Echoes ripple around its songs, essays. Posters, but the surface remains what it has always been. Labor tuned to a held second. If you keep your eyes on the work, the myths thin. What's left is stronger. A stage with no sky. A pause that respects breath. A world that asks you to sit, learn, and not rush past the edge you feel.